Thank you very much everyone for coming. My name is Adil Najam. I am the director of the Frederick S. Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. It's a great honor and a pleasure to welcome all of you to this, the last of our seminars in the seminar series for this year. And it's a great honor and pleasure to welcome actually all three of our presenters, and I'll say a bit about them in a minute. It's really a pleasure to have them here. This particular seminar is slightly different from our others, even though the conversation will be very much similar. We meet here today at the end of the semester to celebrate and to talk about and to think back on a year full of activities in our program called Africa 2060. The main event in that program of activities was a major conference held earlier this year in April here at Boston University called Africa 2060, the good news from Africa. The conference was organized by the Pardee Center in collaboration with APARC, the African Presidential Archive and Research Center, and the African Studies Center here at Boston University, and also the Center for Global Health and Development at the School of Public Health. And in that conference for a whole day, we had a very interesting discussion, a discussion which I think surprised most people there, including I think some of the speakers, because sort of we put this title up there, Good News from Africa, which was not to say that you forget about the news that is not good news or ignore the trends that may not be good, but to try to focus also on those trends that are either good or have the potential of making things in the continent better. And we had a wonderful set of panels. We had 4 panels all day, and what we are here today to launch is the report of that conference which just came out. There should be copies of this report at the back if you want to pick one up. There should also be a copy of a whole set of other papers and research that has been produced in reference to this report. Just very briefly, I should say we've tried to change the format of conference reports. So rather than just saying, who said what, which we say very briefly in about 3 or 4 pages, most of this report is actually a reflection, sitting back at the end of the conference, Julius and myself, and saying what were the big themes, and we identify 7 themes that Julius will talk about that we took. That the presenters may or may not agree with, but here is what we heard. And also at the back of the report is a statistical section where we had our Boston University graduate students, 4 of them, work on various trends and look at what is happening in Africa in the short and long term, and those are pieces by them that add to that. I should also note that there's a whole series, as I said, of publications, including the last 3 ones, a paper on coffee, a paper on sub-Saharan Africa, quantitative analysis, and a paper on narcotics trafficking in West Africa and the governance challenges related to that. In addition, there's a whole bunch of others that are also there. I say this simply to encourage you to please pick these up, and if not, all of them are available for download on the website. A overall paper about the conference will also be published in the journal Futures in March, which will look at the trends. So my apologies for that rather long introduction to this, but I wanted to do that simply to give you a sense that what we want to talk about here is an ongoing set of activities, but the set of activities that are ongoing at Boston University at all points and all points of time on Africa are much, much larger and much, much broader than that. And one of the key aspects that we wanted to highlight in the conference is just how much of Africa happens at Boston University, and just how much of Africa in very many different ways happens at different parts of Boston University. And I think those of us who are here are sometimes ourselves surprised to find how much of that happens at the medical college, at the medical school, here on the Charles River campus, at various places. And this is why this particular panel gives me great pleasure to introduce. We have Ambassador Charles Stith. Ambassador Stith heads and has created and led this one of the most interesting institutes, I think, anywhere on the university landscapes, the African Presidential Archives and Research Center, and the model of getting these leaders from Africa to Boston University to spend time with the faculty, to spend time with the students, and I've seen myself that they spend sort of real quality time with the students. This is just an amazing set of activities, and I hope he'll be talking a bit about that. We also have Professor Tim Longman, who heads Boston University's Center for African Studies, one of the premier centers on the subject anywhere in the country, and certainly the hub of activity on scholarship on Africa in the Boston area. And again, it's a great pleasure to have both of you, especially since you were co-sponsors of the conference. I'm also very, very glad to have with us again Julius Kariuki was at that point a research fellow, a postdoc research fellow at the center, and he is a visiting fellow here at the center. He is now currently in Ghana, in Accra at ACET, and he'll talk a bit about that. But he continues to be a fellow here at the center, is the author of a lot of some of the material that you see there. So with that rather long introduction, and with a promise not to make my other remarks as long, what we want to do is to just open up with just very brief opening remarks from the three panelists, maybe about 10 minutes each, and then open up to a conversation. And really on this larger question, which was the question for the conference and the question for today, that when we look at the long term for Africa, what are the type of trends, what are the type of drivers, what is the big news that you see, be it good news or bad news, but what are the big things when we get past the daily headline, when we get past the micro trends that consume the firefighters of the political world? What are the big things coming down the pike that you think is going to influence Africa and the perception of Africa in the world? Could I start with you, Ambassador Stith?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me commend you for the great work that you're doing here at the Pardee Center. In general, looking at future trends globally, but particularly as it relates to Africa. And as you alluded to a moment ago, I think one of the things that's very special about this university is the complex of centers and programs and scholars that we have focused on the continent of Africa, which I think is unique and positions us uniquely so to make a major contribution not only to the pedagogical mix of this university, but nationally and internationally as well. So I'm proud to have been asked to participate in this. I'm proud of the work that you're doing, and I'm proud of the collection of scholars and resources that we have here focused on Africa. Let me also commend you on the conference that you held focusing on the good news coming out of Africa. Far too often the Academy lags behind the rest of the world in terms of picking up trends and developments that are of consequence. But I think this is one of those cases where we're on the point or close to the point. And I think that's reflected in the work that all of us are doing in various ways. A good friend of mine from Hong Kong, the head of the Asian Business Council, and I spoke there this summer, sent me a copy of a recent report by the McKinsey Group on Africa, which focused on this theme, the good news out of Africa. And there is good news. The part of what we focus on in our work at APARC is tracking current trends and developments on the continent. You know, I think there are several areas that speak to this notion that the continent is trending in the right way. You know, first is in the area of governance. We track 16 countries on the continent, which we surmise are serious about governance on the continent. And while 16 countries only represent a third of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, that's the bad news. The good news is that they're the most heavily populated countries on the continent, and in those 16 countries you have about 2/3 of the population of the continent. And so what that means is that the majority of folks on the continent are waking up every morning in the country where they have the right, opportunity, and obligation to select those folks who will lead and to hold those folks accountable for moving those countries forward. The second area, I think, of good news is on the economy. And I think that's reflected in a number of ways. One, going back to the Clinton years with the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, where we recalibrated our relationship with the continent to focus not simply on aid, but on trade, and seeing the development of African economies as essential to moving the continent forward and expanding opportunities. Represented a turning point for the continent that was significant. Subsequently, we saw the Bush administration not only pick up on where we left off in the Clinton administration, but extended and expanded AGOA. And in addition, we've seen billions of dollars pumped into the economy of Africa via such initiatives as the Millennium Challenge Initiative. Much of that money has gone into supporting infrastructure development, which is so critical to the development of economies. The other point that I would note is at the grassroots level, there is a vibrancy. You see it in terms of governance. I was just on the continent for 10 days over the Thanksgiving holiday, and one of the places I visited was my old stomping grounds in Tanzania, and had an opportunity to meet with the president and some of the new members of his cabinet. He was just reelected on the 31st of October with 61% of the vote. That seems like a mandate, and I guess it really is. The interesting caveat is that when he was elected 5 years ago, he got elected with 80% of the vote. And what that signals, is, I think it represents less a dissatisfaction with what he's doing and more a heightened sense of expectation on the part of people at the grassroots level, and also the sense that they're taking this business called democracy very seriously, and they're listening to what people have to say, and just because you're in doesn't mean you had a right to be in. That they're holding the politicians there accountable to the same kind of standard that we see in democracies all over the world. And that, I think the standard was expressed most eloquently by that great 20th century philosopher, Janet Jackson, who said, "What have you done for me lately?" Folks are looking at that. You see it on the private sector side with the vibrance of the economy. The entrepreneurial spirit is alive and well across Dar es Salaam. The cityscape is dotted by new construction. When we did the conference here in October, Maletsi and Becky was here. We had a good laugh that he had not been back to Dar es Salaam until we did our conference there in August. And the Kilimanjaro Hotel at which we stayed in August was not the Kilimanjaro, Eduardo, that he remembered 25 years ago. So you see those kind of changes at the grassroots level, and the continent is trending, I think, in the right direction. Can we anticipate that the change will be without fits and starts? The obvious answer to that question is no, neither on the governance side or on the economic side. But as long as the trajectory is headed north, and in this case, north being good, I think it's going to be an exciting place to be and an exciting place to watch over the next 25, 30 years.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll go to Tim Longman. Before I do that, we also want to talk once we come to the Q&A about what is going to keep or what could keep the good news from turning good. What's the hurdle to these things reaping the benefits? But the one thought I had when you were talking, Ambassador, was 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago now, we had our conference on Latin America 2060. So these were people from Latin America. It was at a smaller scale, but very similar topic, very similar people, and a pall of depression in the room. They put up graph after graph after graph of economic performance and social performance and government performance, which we in Asia would have loved to have. Most of Africa would have loved to have. But what wasn't there was this sense of the possible. There was a sense that we are a region in decline. Now, I'm probably exaggerating, but there was a palpable difference. And even though sort of at our conference, it wasn't as if everyone thought everything was hunky-dory. But there was a sense of the possibility. And maybe I was reading it wrong, but Tim will let us know if I am.
Thank you again for inviting us here and for the excellent conference that we had last spring. In particular, I think it's great that we have, it's both online for those who weren't able to attend, and now we have a nice report coming out of it that is more of a reflection on some of the issues that were raised. Just by way of introduction, as you mentioned, BU has one of the oldest and most respected African Studies programs in the country. We have over 90 faculty who are African Studies affiliates and about 20 area scholars who are also affiliated with the center. We deal with a wide range of topics that touch on almost all of the countries in Africa. And just from looking at the kinds of activities that are going on, you can get a real sense of the dynamism that's present in the continent. We have a project that looks at the use of Arabic script in West African languages. We're starting up several projects working on South Africa and looking at education and technology and education there, and also developing new curricula modules on the history of apartheid compared to the history of the civil rights movement in the U.S. We have a number of projects in Ethiopia where we're very active. My own work centers mostly on areas that tend to be less optimistically viewed, which is Central Africa, Rwanda, Burundi, and Congo. I, in another life, was a human rights worker and researcher, and do a lot of my work on civil wars and human rights violations and ethnic conflict and things of that sort. And so I come from a background that one would expect would be very pessimistic about Africa's future. And yet I find myself sort of unrelentingly optimistic. Not that I see all trends going well, but I actually see extraordinary potential in Africa, and even in some of the places that are the worst off, places like Congo, where you just seem to have perpetual chaos, or Rwanda, where you have a real growing authoritarianism. I still see a lot of cause for hope. The area, for me, that doesn't get enough attention, that really does, is something that Ambassador Stith has already mentioned, which is sort of the grassroots level. That the reason that I can remain optimistic about Africa and where I see it going is the extraordinary potential of the people. Because with the experience that Africa has had of particularly brutal and exploitative colonization, and then a neo-colonial period or post-colonial period that has not really allowed nearly enough independence for Africa, and in which economic exploitation has remained extraordinary, in which countries like the United States are making extraordinary profits off of arms sales and a variety of other things that are destabilizing the continent. Despite that, you have a population that manages to survive, and not only to survive, but in many cases to thrive. Where I really see potential is in the people themselves. In places like Congo and in places like Rwanda, when you talk to people at the grassroots level, you get a real sense that not only are they able to deal with the terrible things that happen to them, but they have a wonderful vision of what they want their lives to look like. I gave a talk on Friday about democratization in Rwanda, where I've done most of my research. And one of the things that I found, I went back to my notebooks from research I did in 1992 and 1993 when I was there just prior to the genocide. And I talked to a lot of people about what was going on in the country at that time. And people were very skeptical about some of the changes that were happening at the top in terms of multi-party politics. But people said they really believed in democracy. They just saw democracy as really finding a way to bring power to the people. The key to Africa's future for me is that. It's finding ways that the institutions in Africa can actually bring out the potential of the population. So it's finding governance governments that no longer are a threat to people that they have to be afraid of and distance themselves from, but rather governments that reach down to the population and that open up the potential of the people and allow people to make decisions about their own lives that are important. I think when we look at trends in almost any field, that's where the potential for good developments has to lie. If we're talking about economics, well, the idea of liberalization is to actually limit some of the control at the top economically so that you can allow the potential at the bottom to really begin to flourish. And I think that is something that's going to be key for the future. It's true as we look at the growth of civil society as well. As civil society really began to develop in Africa in the 1980s particularly, it was very top-heavy, based in the capital cities, involving mostly elites. But the trend now increasingly is to have grassroots development, where you see in so many communities that people are organizing themselves, whether it's a group of a Catholic women's prayer group somewhere that comes together to try to set up a development project, or a group of market women organizing to protect their rights, or new human rights groups at the local levels. There's a real growth of civil society that's happening at the grassroots. There are places where that's being repressed. There are places where leaders really realize, and I think they're correct, that if you allow these developments to happen, it's going to change what Africa is. And the truth is that there are some people who've profited off of Africa's misery. And those people are going to be fighting back and trying to protect their interests. And so as an international community, one of the things we need to do is, well, a couple of things. One is to be aware that some of those people who have profited off of the misery of Africa are here. And in fact, we have dirty hands that we need to acknowledge. And secondly, as we think about our role in the future, acknowledging that, in fact, there are ways that we can positively support these developments in Africa by asking what is going to be empowering the people, what's going to be allowing them to enrich themselves and to take control of their lives. I think there is a lot of potential if we can organize institutions in a way that bring out the strengths of the population and allow the population to organize.
Thank you very much. A lot of food for thought there, and I think I hope a lot of things that we will have more discussions on. But this notion that if there is good news, it will grow from the bottom up, not fall from the top down, is an interesting one. One of the comments, Julius, that was made at the conference, someone I remember mentioning that Africa has always been on the brink of breakthrough. That at any point, if you wanted to search for the good trends, you could find them as easily as you would find the bad trends if you were looking for the good trends. And I constantly wonder, were we finding these trends because we were looking for the good news, or is the good news more sustainable? Julius, as I said, was a fellow, is a visiting fellow here, and one of the authors of our summary. So I'll ask him to say something from there.
Yes, as Professor Adil has mentioned, I'm currently at the Africa Center of Economic Transformation, based in Accra, Ghana. But we are dealing with the whole of Africa. And as the title suggests, we are working on transforming economies of Africa. And the whole idea of trying to transform is that, as has been mentioned, we see Africa going on a trajectory and we have all the good news, then suddenly something happens. In the 60s, we saw everybody said Africa was a poster child of development. Then come 70s, by 80s, Africa was seen as a basket case. Then again, we start seeing rise, we start seeing Africa Renaissance, which started in about 1990. And we are still on that upward trajectory. But who knows what happens in the future. But if you look at the economic trends that we have seen, you would see that much as it was driven by commodities, basically demand from China for African commodities. If you look at countries that don't have resource commodities, countries like Kenya, which are resource poor, and other countries, both equally did well. Resource-rich countries did well, resource-poor countries also did well, meaning that there has been a shift in economy, and this is mostly driven by entrepreneurship. If you look at Africa, you'll see we now have African multinationals, companies that are venturing out into Africa. You have Kenyan companies now going all the way to Southern Sudan, going all the way to Mauritius even. You have South African companies having branches all over Africa. So there is a sense of new African multinationals. A bank from a tiny country called Togo is actually now in 26 countries in Africa. Who would expect Togo to produce a multinational? So there is a growing new business class that is operating in Africa. And also we are seeing innovation happening. For instance, if we talk of Kenya, there's a famous technology that's now called M-Pesa. I don't know whether anybody has heard of it, but it has been cited in economists everywhere. It's a topic of discussion at National Bureau of Economic Research now, because it's one of the few innovations that you would say have come from Africa, and it's now being deployed worldwide. So we have India now is trying to test the mobile banking. We have it in Latin America, yet it's locally developed in Kenya. And beyond that, you are seeing new innovations. For instance, we have now gone from mobile banking to a new bank that is using the same technology to allow you to even transfer money from banks to the mobile phone. You are seeing people using payroll to pay their workers using mobile phones. And mobile phone actually, Kenya is somehow at the cutting edge. You saw there is also another website called Ushahidi, which was actually being used in Haiti, the earthquake. Yeah. In Haiti was being used, they were tracking where people are and what is happening using a technology that is developed in Kenya. So you can see things are, there is innovation happening, and there's certain belief about people's ability to do things. And I guess perception becomes also very, very important. How Africa is seen and how Africa sees themselves. Because Africa has always been seen as this place that need help. But now, obviously with the entry of China, which is looking at Africa in a different way, we are not saying that China necessarily has very, very good motives. Obviously, it's to help itself. But what China is doing is changing Africa from being seen a place to give aid to a place actually where you can do business. The biggest investment ever made in Africa was China buying South Africa Standard Bank. I think an investment of, I don't know, about $5 billion. One huge, showing the confidence actually China has. So China is changing how even the West and other places look. You're also seeing Brazil coming in, and Middle East coming into Africa. But they're always, the same issues of exploitation will always be there. And it depends on Africa to think, how do we negotiate these new trends? Because for instance, China has a clear strategy on Africa. And every 2 years we have a meeting, the FOCAC. But most of the time, China comes with a menu of things and saying, this is what we want to do. There's no time that Africa has come with saying, this is what we want. So Africa is still not playing the role that it should play in terms of negotiating. And also at times, you would hear some trends of going to China just to spite the West. That should not be the case, because it's really neither a friend or what. It's just about thinking, we have something and they want something, and how do we negotiate that? But we are seeing some, at ASSET where I am, we are trying to help African countries to better think how to strategically deal with these new global trends. So I think perception will become very, very important in how Africa mediates all these changes that are happening. So I can say, yes, there is probably some changes that are happening. People are believing more in themselves, and also the world is seeing Africa in a different way. So there's possibility that we will see actual transformation rather than the usual roller coaster where you see things coming and then things going down. So I think we did detect some positive and sustainable trends.
Okay, all three of you have been sort of very, very positive. So the potential is obviously there in your mind. What do you think are the things that might keep the potential from being realized? What do you see there that might turn the roller coaster back into a downward spiral? What would you say are the biggest things to look for? Because in some ways, the way to support a better future is either by doing things that will make things better, or by doing things that will keep the bad things from happening. What might those things be? Any?
Let me preface what I'm going to say by reflecting upon, I think, several factors that are allowing the continent to emerge now. You made the point, which I kind of smiled because it's much more theological than political, that hope abides, that Africa has always been at a point of breakthrough. That's good theology, but probably in terms of political analysis is a bit off. And the reason that I say that is that I think there are four critical reasons that the continent is in a different place today than it was 20 years, 30 years, 40, 50 years ago. One, there's more distance between where the continent is now and where it was at the end of colonialism. A few months ago, I was in Botswana and was hanging out with former President Moai, and we went to his ancestral village, and I was commenting on the tarmac. And I just asked the question, you know, how much tarmac was there when the Brits left? And he said, 16 kilometers. So I said 60. He said, no, 16, wow. 1-6. And you can get anywhere around the country that you want to get on tarmac road. And that has as much to do with the time it takes to develop infrastructure as anything else. Secondly, the Cold War is over. You know, for Africa, calling it a Cold War was a euphemism because it was a very hot war. Mm-hmm. And as is a pretty common sense point, you can't begin reconstruction during war. You have to wait till war is over. Thirdly, you know, we've moved beyond the era of structural adjustments. You know, the world lamented and in some cases lambasted Africa and African leadership because it wasn't more prepared to deal with the AIDS pandemic. But right around the time they should have been gearing up institutionally was when we had this Washington consensus, which was forcing the continent to cut back in all of these areas. And fourthly, and Julius alluded to it a moment ago, that with the end of apartheid, it not only was transfiguring relative to South Africa, but it also freed up the human capital and financial capital of that country to help drive economic development in other places. Now, that's the preface to the point. Now, and I wanted to do that because I think one clear and present danger that could adversely affect where the continent goes is how the competition for resources between China and the West plays out. If it takes on...
Whether that becomes the other Cold War.
That's right. If it becomes as adversarial as was the U.S.-Russia, the confrontation, it could have disastrous result. The other thing, and it relates to something I alluded to earlier, that one of the big issues that all of the guys I talk to regularly face, the good news is that there's development going on and there are high expectations. The bad news is there's development going on and there's high expectations. The reality is it is going to be impossible to meet in a material sense the expectations, the growing expectations that people have on the ground. And so how leadership on the one hand encourages the kind of entrepreneurial spirit, the can-do, the spirit around growing economies on the one hand, and on the other hand, kind of tapping down enthusiasm is going to be critical, and that's no easy feat to accomplish. We did, as you know, a summit in Berlin a couple of years ago on land reform in Africa, and I won't go into why we chose Berlin, but I had a conversation with the mayor of Berlin, and I was asking about the integration of East Berlin into the mainstream and East Germany into the mainstream. And he commented they had spent $30 billion. And yet there were still some tension points, that it wasn't complete. And you think with, you know, the second or third most dynamic economy in the world, you know, where you've got some degree of homogeneity between populations, you know, one side of this false divide, and that transition hadn't been completed in a generation, then you can project very easily that it's going to take 2, 3, maybe 4 generations to move significantly beyond the divides that exist in Africa. It's a hard sell. It's a hard sell
And a slow one.
When you see, you know, the guy or gal from your village now driving a Mercedes, you know, and you're still riding a bicycle, you know, you want to know where's mine? And so, you know, how you deal with that is going to be critical, which leads me to my third point, that this process of growth and development is dynamic. It's not going to come solely from the bottom up. It's not solely going to come from the top down. You've got to have something happening at both ends of the spectrum in order for this thing to work. Because leadership does matter. And it particularly matters on the issue that I just referenced. And that is, you can convince people to sacrifice for a future generation. You can convince people that it's not the material things that give absolute substance to life. But the messenger, the only messenger capable of selling that story is somebody who has, and perceived to have, integrity and credibility and a commitment to people at the grassroots level.
Excellent. Anything from the two of you before we open up?
In terms of what gets in the way, I think Ambassador Stith is quite right to say that Africa's moved a lot in the 50 years since independence, but I think sometimes in the West we don't perceive that. And there's a tendency for us to repeat some of the same mistakes. One of the things that we did during the Cold War in particular was that we picked people that we thought were, you know, anti-communist, and we backed them no matter what they did. And I think there is still a tendency for us to pick those we think are right because they're going to stand up for Western capitalist interests against the Chinese, or also because they're going to support us in the war on terror. They've promised to have a secular state against political Islam, things of that sort, which are becoming increasingly important in Africa. And I think there is a real problem when we end up propping up people who are not in fact the great leaders. That are people. Yeah, we're too strategic, but also it's strategy based on a lack of real understanding of Africa. And so I think it's very important for us in the West to think carefully about our role and to listen to Africans, to not assume that we know what's best and that we know all the answers. One of the things that I think was great about our conference on this was that we actually had a number of African voices that were present there. And I think that's often not the case, in fact, that we don't bring very many Africans into the conversation. We assume that we know best. And the only ones we talk to tend to be sort of the elites who may be very westernized themselves. But it's really thinking about, well, what is it that the countries in Africa want, meaning the people, not just the leadership, and to try to see how we can get these good leaders.
And all three of you have now mentioned China, and I'll repeat something that I said, and we'll open up. So if you have questions, please raise your hands. We'll have a microphone which will do nothing to the sound, but you will be recorded for all posterity if you use it. So while you think of your questions, one of the things that I noted when we were closing the conference was that we spent a whole day in Boston, Massachusetts. More than half of our speakers were from Africa. More than half the room, or at least half the room, were Africans. And I asked the people, guess which country was mentioned more often than any other country? There were presentations from all over Africa. The one country talked about more often than any other country in a conference on Africa 2060 was China. By far. The other big surprise was how little the US was mentioned. And I still cannot make fully what the implication of that was, but it has strayed with me as sort of this lesson. Maybe that conversation was off course, but I don't think it was. Questions, comments, reactions? Anyone? Gentleman at the back. We'll take 2 or 3 and then come back.
Hi, my name is Divya V, and I'm from Senegal and Ghana, by my family origins. One comment quickly and a couple of questions to you. Professor Longman just said something that I think is fundamental. From my perspective, looking at Africa from the bottom up, over the last 50 years, which is longer than I've been on Earth, but what I've seen, yes, the leadership has been wrong, essentially because people who picked the leadership did not know the continent, did not understand it. And I can take any number of countries. I'm not going to mention Botswana because it's too small to represent a trend, but I could mention many other countries, including Gabon, but from Gabon and a number of others you can look at it. And I think that has been one big problem for Africans to deal with, because we had a leadership in place that we could not remove, and a leadership that was not there to serve the interest of Africa and its people. Now, as we look today, the analysis that I hear, for the most part, mentions what's going on with others, the external agents to the continent, but really the internal agents and the goals are the people who live in Africa or who are Africans. We hear what the Chinese want to do, which is great. We hear what the United States has in mind, or what England or France or the Germans have in mind. But we don't hear in the conversation what Africans have in mind. And I think that's a recipe for disaster. So a question to all our panelists is, from your experiences, what have you heard from Africans on the ground that's relevant and that you think is important? Second question, given that the schemes of the past have failed, whether they came from the World Bank, the IMF, or any other, the Washington-based institution or non-Washington-based institution, for now, what do you see as the most likely scheme to at least make sustainable progress a reality on the continent? Which is not to say everybody's going to drive a Mercedes. I don't think in the United States everybody drives a Cadillac. So that's never, I don't think that should be part of the conversation, because it's not realistic. Now, what would you define as sustainable development? How to achieve it for the next 20 years?
What's the goal?
Thanks.
What's the goal? Maybe we can take just one. Okay.
Yes, my name is Orbiston, and I must say I admire the effort to project that far in the future, which is a characteristic.
It takes courage.
of the Pardee Center, of course. But let's face it, in 50 years' time, few of us will be around. I certainly won't. And so it's a little iffy to project that far into the future, because a lot of things can happen in the interval. It seems to me that where Africa's development of any sort is concerned, two major factors, more or less mutually dependent variables, are to be considered, and one concerns political development, the other one concerns economic development. Now, as far as political development is concerned, there again, shall we say, since we're talking about a sort of long-term horizon, it's almost impossible to predict just what's going to happen. Ambassador Stith mentioned a number of countries that are doing well. I think I might dispute the findings in terms of the amount of the percentage of the overall population of the continent that's on the right track, you might say. And there's certainly plenty of countries that are facing stormy weather ahead, beginning with Nigeria or Congo, which continues ineffectively, and a number of other countries, including the Ivory Coast, which incidentally 50 years ago had a projection being made in 1960 over a 50-year horizon, would have probably been regarded as a one, quote, most likely to succeed. And obviously there are some bumps along the road there. So in any case, like I said, as far as I can project ahead, I see stormy weather and uncertain development, some good, some bad, some in between, let's face it. That's the story of the world, by the way. It's not just Africa as far as that is concerned. But where economic development is concerned now, there is something to think about. We're all focusing on China, rightly so. As a matter of fact, I ran for 2 years a seminar on China and Africa here, and there were more questions than answers, obviously, because we really don't know what's going on. But the more we know about what China is doing in Africa, the more we are beginning to discover that what they're doing, in effect, shall we say, is a sort of barter type of arrangement with African countries, in which, in effect, technology transfer, infrastructure development, and so on and so forth, is paid for out of the primary resources of the African continent, mostly mineral resources, but also agricultural export. In effect, we see the very same economic products that Africa has been traditionally supplying. You know, raw materials. Now, if that's what's going to be going on over the next 50 years, I don't see much to be optimistic about, partly because there will be more of the same. In effect, I'll say, you know, Africans will be the hewers of wood and drawers of water, if you will, and will have very little to show for it, but also because the resources in question, especially mineral resources, are finite and they're exhaustible. So what happens, and what has already happened to a number of African countries, is that after the copper or the nickel or the iron or whatever, shall we say, runs out, you may be left with nothing more than a hole in the ground and a railroad that leads to it, but very little in terms of what might be called self-sustaining development. Until Africa starts to shift away from the production of raw materials and gets into manufacturing, transformation, and so on and so forth, which a few countries have done in a very limited way. You and I know about places like Mauritius, for instance, which is always, you know, sort of mentioned as a prime example of that sort of thing, but it's a very lonely and very marginal example. So I think that one of the things in which and I haven't seen the report, that has to be considered when we're trying to figure out what's going to be happening over the next 5 decades, really ought to center on economics. Because politics will take care of itself in a number of ways, and if there's a dependent variable there, I would say that politics, good or bad, will depend on economic returns, good or bad. I don't know what you want to comment about that, you, Tim.
This woman had her hand up back here.
We'll take one more and then we'll come back to the panel. Thank you.
Oh, I thought she had her hand up. You were scratching your head.
What do you think about the future of race relations in African continent and how that will be in 2060?
Future of race relations. So we've got a spectrum here of very interesting questions, including from Professor Bustan. And at the conference itself, this came up a number of times, including from Robert Rothberg, that there were times earlier when the countries we thought would be the great transformers. I don't know if he mentioned it, but someone mentioned Zimbabwe. There was a time when Mr. Mugabe was seen as a very different Mr. Mugabe. And but what I found particularly interesting for all of you, all three of the questions, but one of the ones I would like to push on from Professor Bustan is that you seem to be suggesting, sir, that it will be economics and the economic development that could drive the politics in a different direction. And at least some of our speakers seem to suggest the opposite, that you'll need to get the politics right before the economics can really be right. And maybe it's both, but on any of those, any of the three of you. Julius.
If I was comment, yeah, the economics, you need to get it right. And the politics, you also need to get it right. And actually, to me, they feed on each other, because what you need is a capable state that can mobilize resources, a state that can negotiate deals and so on. In Africa, in our work, what we have realized, a lot of states don't have the capacity. For instance, we were working on a case in Liberia. China has come with this huge mining project where they'll build ports, they'll build railways, they'll build a mining, and you have people negotiating with Chinese, and the people you are seeing in Liberia from post-conflict construction, these are people who came the other day from all over the world. They are people in their 30s. Yet here you are negotiating really, really complex deals. I don't think they know what's happening. And that's one of the worst things that we have in Africa. We don't have capacity. But how do you build capacity? That becomes an issue, because sometimes you build capacity, you have brain drain. So that will always be a challenge. But we have to find innovative ways of bringing capacity. For instance, it makes no sense, if you don't have capacity in your government, to still insist you want negotiators from your country. I'm sure if you came to New York or wherever and just hired good lawyers, they will still be your agent. I don't think they will work against you because there is this conspiracy against you. No. It's just a question of thinking how best to have temporary solutions and long-term solutions. Train more people, but in the meantime, the deals are here, they have to be made. How do you negotiate them? That's one issue that we have found in Africa very, very difficult to handle. Complex deals, no people to look. And we are actually helping in our organization, especially on extractive resources, how to negotiate these deals. And the other thing you've mentioned is about how to move away from mineral dependency. And we have actually been seeing some transition. You find that some economies in Africa now are almost 50% services and even beyond. So there is a move from, in some countries where you are seeing services, banking and telecoms and retailing grow rapidly. You have a growing middle class in Africa that is pushing new industries in some countries. Although there are still countries that are highly dependent on mineral resources, yes. But there are good examples that we can learn from. The other thing I think was mentioned was, what do we need to do, okay, to move ahead? To me, I think Ambassador Stith had mentioned, one thing is, a key issue in Africa is land rights. Almost 80% of Africa land is really not titled. Where I am in Ghana, you have people building 20-story structures on land actually they don't have a title on. Yes, and that's happening. People investing, and I don't think it takes a lot to do that, but I think African governments have just been lazy about it. Because this is one area you don't need outside help to determine how to allocate land and how to make sure land rights are secure.
It's more than laziness, probably. It's not easy either, politically, the costs of the political costs.
Yeah, obviously there are politics about it. But in most cases, I would say like countries like Kenya, where you had colonial land that was taken and the elites took some land away, but there are not that many countries that were really settled and where you have these issues. Most of the other lands, like in West Africa, they are really with the chiefs. It's a question of how to use the chiefs as, integrate them in the local, I think in the national government. I'm not sure, probably Ambassador Stith has studied this more, but that's one issue that Africa should be thinking of, because you can unlock a lot of potential just having secure land rights and letting business happen.
I'm actually curious, since you've been looking at this quite a bit. I mean, there is DeSoto's very influential with this argument that if you get land right, everything else will fall into place. But it's quite controversial. Yeah. So there are people who are just going to, I'm curious, since you've had a couple of conferences on land rights. How
do you get land right?
Well, and is it that important?
I think it's absolutely important. I think the DeSoto is onto something. He's actually participated in the meeting we did in Dar es Salaam in August. Yeah, it's one of these things that's simple and yet complex. I mean, it's simple at the end of the day. You got land and you got people, and the people want land. So, how hard can that be at the end of the day? But from a technical perspective, you've got to do it in a way that it unleashes the capital value inherent in the land, which means that it's got to be done within a framework that allows you to collateralize whatever it is you have so that you can then turn it into money. I mean, to say it, rather crassly. And part of that is technical. Part of it is it's mundane, and it starts to run up some costs because you got to pay somebody to do the work. Mm-hmm. But having said that, it's not, an insurmountable challenge, and it's not a challenge that the world hadn't faced in other environments before. I was reading a very interesting article about post-World War II Japan. One of the first things that MacArthur did was divvied up the land. I mean, so, there are models for getting this kind of stuff done. And it is, it's important and it's doable. Again, I think that the point that Edward raised a moment ago about the economics, if you get that right, the other stuff will follow. It really, the process is dynamic. I mean, it really is kind of both and. One of the issues that we dealt with when I was in Tanzania was the importance of, on the one hand, getting the regulatory environment right, so that when investors came in, the rules by which they were asked to play were rules that were familiar. On the other hand, equally as important, Doden Copper, look, when you come to the States, you don't need to come by yourself. You need to bring a bunch of business people. and to use your convening power and your power of access to open up doors for them that they couldn't open up for themselves, and let them go at it. Don't try to micromanage it. Make it clear this is not a field trip. You're not paying their way. If they can't afford to pay their way, doesn't mean they're bad people. This is just not their time. So the process is really dynamic. Now on the future thing, I would agree reluctantly with one of the premises of Edward, that 50 years from now, probably we're not going to be around. I'm trying to fight it, but you're probably right. But having said that...
That's the best part of this job.
You can't be held accountable.
That's the best part of being at Pardee.
The good news, though, I think about an approach like that, is that it does put issues in a broader perspective, which is important for a lot of reasons. It helps, doesn't guarantee, but it helps ensure that the kind of planning that you do is as comprehensive as it needs to be. And it cuts against this idea of quick fixes to serious problems. So I think that this kind of long-range planning thing is, important from that perspective, and thus, I would strongly encourage it. And I think just in terms of the vision of your work, if you made no other contribution, quite frankly, than getting folks to start to think 50 years out relative to how you deal with some of these seemingly intractable problems, you would have accomplished something great.
I want to push Tim, because you asked the question on the land one, but if I can just take that opportunity, as a number of you have heard from me, we at the center try not to be in the prediction business. Because we don't know anyone else who's been very good at the prediction business. And so part of the idea of the 2060 or the future really is that all the, well, maybe not all, but many of the really important problems we face are all long-term. Whether it's security, whether it's poverty, whether it's human rights, whether it's terrorism, whether it's development or poverty, and yet the incentives for most of the decision makers are all short-term. If you are a politician, you worry about getting elected. If you are a businessman, you worry about your quarterly report, your stock price, your annual report. If you are an academic, you worry about tenure. So what we want to do, what we really want to do, is to look at the issues today and look at the shadow of the future.
A quick caveat, though, that I think is important. With business people, I mean, your short-term focus is always your balance sheet. It's always your balance sheet. This notion of only short-term results, unfortunately, is a uniquely American phenomenon.
It may be, yeah.
Which is why we're falling behind the curve. In most other parts of the world, folks are looking at this kind of long-distance thing. I won't let you say what you're going to say. I just wanted to make that intervention. But I do want to come back to the race question, too.
I want to come back to the race question, too, because that I really want to hear about. But Tim, since you asked the question to the ambassador about land, I don't want to let the land issue drop, because there's the other land question too, which came up at the conference, if I might, which is what some people call the land grab, the buying of large amount of land.
Well, that's what I was going to say, actually, in terms of to get to that question of is it politics or is it economics. I think land is actually an interesting issue. You're looking at countries that you're assuming are relatively democratic, or at least the more democratic in Africa. But if you have land titling in countries which are dictatorships, then you know that the results of that are not going to be turning land over to the people who have had the rights. I've seen this process going on in Rwanda right now, where there is a big move towards land titling that's going to lead to consolidation of land in the hands of those who have political power. I think one of the things about thinking about the long-range future is also looking at the past, and it encourages us to look at trajectories and how things have gone. In Africa, the initial attempt was to focus on politics. So seek ye first the political kingdom was the famous mantra in the 1960s, and all else will follow. Well, that turned out not to be very true, and so in the 70s and 80s, when you had consolidation of power in authoritarian hands, the emphasis was, don't worry about politics, we just have to get economics right. And so I actually tend to think they check one another, they have to go hand in hand. And I think it sounds like we're all sort of in unanimity on that it's not easy to do it, but that there is some dialogue between the two. I would pick up on the issue of beyond race relations. I would talk about identity politics, really, and it's one of these issues where I think Ambassador Stith is quite right. I emphasize a lot on the grassroots, but it's also important to think about the leadership and the role that leadership plays in helping to either manipulate the grassroots in bad ways or to bring out its potential. And I think as someone who works on conflict, I see that a lot. Leadership does matter, as you've already said. And if you have leaders that really try to exploit people's difference, they can often be very successful at it, particularly in conditions of severe poverty. And so I think it's going to depend a lot on the leadership's commitment to having a better vision of unifying people. But also, frankly, it's going to have to depend on the people themselves refusing to be manipulated. And so as you have a growth of human rights organizations on the continent, as you've seen, as you have a growth of women's organizations and farmers' cooperatives and a whole lot of things at the grassroots, I think that building that human capital is one of the things that actually can help to resist the ability of leadership to manipulate, even when you do get those bad leaders. So I'm hopeful that if we find ways to continue to support the growth at the grassroots, that even when you get those leaders who don't have good intentions in mind, it'll be harder to push people in bad directions.
That's the race relations, identity.
Yeah, I think it's one of these subjects. And here I think Africa is in this way similar to the United States. You know, we're on the issues around race, we're too quick to declare victory. Mm-hmm. And you know, go back to our places of comfort. You know, we look at South Africa, for example, you know, with the monumental changes that have taken place in that country, and they have been nothing short of monumental. Still percolating below the surface are some of the same animosities that had their roots in the era of apartheid and before. And they're not being dealt with on the radar screen as they need to be. And we see it all across the continent. That is the kind of stuff that people don't talk about in polite conversation, but everybody talks about when they're with their own tribe. And I think that in order for the continent to move forward even more dramatically than it has up to this point, that conversation is going to have to move beyond being subterranean. It's absolutely critical. The question that the gentleman raised over here about what Africans are saying about where they are, I wouldn't be so presumptuous as to try to answer that question globally. But to the folks that I speak to on a regular basis, you know, the conversations, from my perspective, are the kind of conversations you expect people to have about where they hope to be. For politicians is, you know, I want to be elected, I want to stay elected. You know, for people at the grassroots level, while I use a rather extreme example of the Mercedes over against the bicycle, you know, the reality is that, you know, the average person, the average family, you know, wants a home that they can call their own. They want the opportunity to send their kids to a school so that they can grow and develop and fulfill their potential. And I think probably the biggest thing is the point that I made earlier. And people are committed to seeing the kind of changes take place that allow them and their children to realize their potential. You know, you talk about land in the context of a dictatorship. You know, can you say Madagascar? You know, when they made this play, when the government made this play to sell the huge tracts of land to the Koreans, it brought down the government. You know, so folks, you know, get it, and probably, which we haven't said much about at this point, but one of the great impetus for the changes taking place is this thing. You know, people know what's going on. You know, we had President Mutharika from Malawi here in September. Some of you got the notice. We were also supposed to have Gubuza from Mozambique, and he couldn't come. He couldn't come because they were having food riots. It was announced that the price of bread was going to increase 30%. Mass protests were launched with these. The work stoppage that shut down the country, there was no mass meeting. You know, there was no charismatic leader, you know, that called everybody together and gave a rousing speech and said, this is where we're going. The text went out, hey, the price of bread is going up 30%. Can't tolerate it. You know, you got to take a step.
And you've seen this elsewhere. In Pakistan, the country I come from, this major judicial crisis was really sort of the movement was run out of Twitter.
That's right. That's right.
You know, Twitter in a country with very low literacy, but it doesn't take too much literacy to type in 140 characters.
That's right.
You know, that's the magic of it. But I want to push on this. We're not going to take more questions because, and I apologize for that, but because the ambassador has to go. But let me ask one question before we wrap up with some other thoughts. But this thing that the ambassador just mentioned, and you had also earlier alluded to, I think of the wonderful question the gentleman had asked there. It's not as if there is one African opinion and there's one outside opinion. Part of the messiness of grappling with democracy is that you suddenly realize that everyone you thought like you doesn't think like you. And that becomes a challenge in itself. So when you talk about sort of, you know, this grassroots hope, this dealing with the messiness of democracy, do you see sort of the appetite for that? Because that's a difficult road, and a road that needs a lot of patience.
One of my, I'm a big believer in democracy, but not necessarily
You're in good company here.
What we usually mean by it, though. I actually think there's a problem if we assume that democracy in 50 years is going to look like it does now. In part because of you have democratizing technologies that change how people relate to one another and relate to their governments. Because of a variety of trends. I think that one of the things we have been very slow to open up to is the idea that we need to rethink what democracy is about. Our focus has been so much on elections, and so much U.S. and international foreign policy focuses on, you know, getting elections right, and constitutions. It's the other big focus. You know, if you get the right constitution written, then everything will fall into place. And I think we have not focused enough on transforming cultures and thinking about democratic values. And I also frankly think that our thinking about human rights issues and this element, if we think about a liberal democracy being about the will of the majority, but also protection of minorities, and that's minorities not just ethnic and racial and clan minorities, but also minorities of opinion. If we think about democracy having these two major sides, we haven't really focused enough on that idea. Our approach to human rights up to this point has been too focused on a very legalistic sort of international law approach, and not nearly enough of a focus on thinking about changing public attitudes and changing political culture. The only way you're really going to get respect for human rights is if you get people who are more tolerant. If you get politicians who aren't afraid to be criticized and don't think that criticism actually weakens them or weakens the country. And so I think as we look at the future of sort of democratization in Africa, we need to open ourselves up to the idea that Africa is going to have to create democracy on its own terms. And that is going to come from leaders at the top. It's going to come from people organizing at the bottom. But it also may look very different in 50 years from what we think it is democratic today. They may find new structures. They may find new ways of organizing things. But it's going to have to really be something that comes out of African culture One of the things that's often not realized is that before colonialism, there were a lot of democratic practices in Africa that were wiped out. Even where you had monarchies that were fairly powerful, there were always checks on power, whether it was a queen mother or competing clans or a council of elders or whatever it may have been. And then you had some structures that were very democratic. There's no way that we can go back, but we do need to realize that Africa does have that potential, that within African cultural traditions, there are real potentials for promoting democracy. But they don't look like democracy in the West, and therefore sometimes we don't recognize them.
Julius, any last thoughts before I ask a closing question and then we wrap?
Maybe I can just mention what we saw as the drivers. And first of all, I guess we also need to, and people have mentioned this to me sometimes, we tend to talk of Africa in monolithic sense, yet Africa is really, if you think of sub-Saharan Africa, is really 48 very, very different countries. And if you want to look at Africa, I think it was mentioned in our talk, Africa can actually be very different in the sense that Africa is richer than India, if you want to look at this as Africa. If you want to look at individual countries, there are like 16 countries in Africa that has higher per capita income than China. So Africa can give you very, very different pictures depending on how you want to look at it. But in terms of the drivers that was seen as important, we had perception, how I've just mentioned how Africa sees itself and how other people see Africa. Governance mentioned here as being very, very critical. Education, and it was mentioned that, yes, education in Africa is really failing, though there are pockets of intelligence. There are people who are really good and can do quite well. Technology, as we have mentioned, was seen as very important. Entrepreneurship was given a lot of thought, that as a key driver. Globalization, we have just mentioned China. And the other thing that was not really, we have not mentioned, it has been alluded to, was society. But in the conference, what came out more was youth, because Africa is actually one of the youngest continents. The median age of Uganda, I think, is 14 years.
Wow.
So in 50 years, Uganda, those people will be there for a long time. And yet Africa is also the fastest urbanizing continent. So you have urbanization and you have youth, two very potent mixes. And when you have urbanization in Africa, you're not talking urbanization driven by people coming to city for jobs. It's actually people running away from rural poverty and creating mega slums. You have Kibera in Kenya. It's now like kind of a tourist attraction, just people to see how people live in deprivation.
When Julius and I were writing our summary, the World Cup was happening. So I was listening on my iPod and on the television all the time to Shakira. Waka Waka, and this is Africa's moment. I remember, I'm from Pakistan, I remember at that time having a conversation with one of our ambassadors in Europe, and he said, what can we do to make Pakistan's image better? And I said, get Shakira. You'll have a problem with the Maulvis, but if you can get her. But it was an amazing moment that one song sort of, certainly in Europe, people just gravitated to it. And as I think of that, a one-word answer, if I might, or a very, very short, very brief question, if we want to make our tomorrows better than they are, what would be the most important thing or one or two things that you would do today that might put us on that path?
Give me the question again.
If we want Africa's tomorrows to be better, what should we be doing today that is
us
or Africa or anyone?
Well, I think you've got to disaggregate the question, because I think there's a role for us. I think part of the role that we have to play is to give Africa some room. This is part of what Tim, implicit at least in what Tim was saying, is give Africa some room. Democracy is, as Churchill says, the greatest form of government. I mean, it's the worst form of government. It's better than everything else. It's messy. By definition, it's messy. And, there are going to be fits and starts, because you've got to balance, on the one hand, the need to empower people at the grassroots level, but on the other hand, you've got to deal with the need to keep the country stable enough to hold the center together long enough for strategies around growth and development to root and to take place. So I think one thing we need to give the continent some room. The other thing is, and this is to come full circle, you raised a theological point in the beginning about hope. I'd raise a theological / moral point about ethics. And that is that we ought to do unto them.
Do unto others as you would, they would do unto us. Yes.
We need to deal with them more fairly and with more integrity. If we do, you can't beat that principle for moving forward.
Yeah.
I think
most important things that you would do.
I think the most important thing we can do is listen to the grassroots. I think too often we listen only to the elites, only to the well-educated, and we undervalue the degree to which local farmers actually know what's good for their land, that local people actually have a lot of knowledge about what would be good for their country. So I think the one thing we don't do well enough is to actually go beyond the elite and talk to people, common African people, whether it's a bicycle taxi man or someone selling fruit on the streets of a city, or if it's a farmer in their fields. They have a lot of good ideas that are not getting tapped, and finding ways to listen to them and help respond to the needs as they perceive them, I actually think has a lot of potential for helping us come up with interesting, creative, new solutions.
Excellent. Last word.
Yeah, I would say, for me, how Africans tell the story of Africa to themselves is very, very important. Because I have been surprised by things that I read about Africa. For instance, one time I came across something that said, 1450, King of Congo gets a printer from Germany with 2 printers and starts schools. I thought this was not true. And I had to go and read further and realize that in 500 years ago, somebody in Congo had actually bought the Gutenberg press and was actually printing paper and actually having schools. Things went wrong, yes. But how many people in Africa know of that?
The stories we tell ourselves, about ourselves.
Yes, so we Africans, the story of Africa is what is fed from a very Eurocentric viewpoint. The stories that we read in history is about a story of the missionary, the story of the colonizer, the story of modernization. But we never hear of stories of Africa when they were doing things. I read about Timbuktu, you read about a university with 25,000 students. You look at the books that were being used in those universities, the equivalent to what they are doing 3rd, 4th years in France in mathematics. But most Africans don't know that. Yet, so we have to understand that, yes, they may have failed in some ways, but it's not because we didn't try, and we should continue trying. And if you look at parallels in other countries, you can see. If you look at China, we talk of China now. But China from about from the fall of the last monarchy to about 1980, it was all chaos for a long time. So Africa needs to get a better perspective of itself and its better story.
Thank you very much. All 3 excellent advice, not only for Africa, but for all regions. I know you have to go. Thank you very much, everyone. May your next year be good. May your next 50 years be good.